I've been invited to another 30-day SMP, and once again, they need a custom world to play in. I'll be creating a vibrant lunar surface, teeming with alien life, and joining over 50 other creators to explore the reaches of space. Join me as we leave the wastes and blast off to the Lunar Phase. I've met with the host of the 30-day SMP series, Mchmu, and we both have much bigger plans this time around. In the Wastes, we were limited both by an intentional design philosophy towards scarce resources, as well as Mchmu's own unfamiliarity with what was possible in custom worldgen. This time, the gloves are off. In order to capture the idea of a lunar surface, obviously we want to use endstone, and probably we're going to extrapolate out from that and create a fairly end-like surface. We're not necessarily trying to go for an end, but it's the overworld type of situation, but the sensations of the end stone in particular, but also to a certain extent the kind of haunting effect that the chorus plants create, these purples and things, will really fit the general vibe and aesthetic that we want for this spacefaring adventure. However, that is pretty much where the similarities are going to end. We still want this to feel like the overworld, so it's not going to be floating islands. It is going to be overworld-like terrain, which will include oceans, this time actually filled with water. While we want parts of this lunar world to feel barren, like the surface of the moon, we don't want it to be completely scarce and wastelandish like the Waste was, and so oceans can absolutely be filled with water and probably all kinds of other life. Now, most of the changes that we want to do are going to be on the surface. The whole surface, or much of it anyway, is going to be endstone, but at a certain point as you descend underground, that endstone is going to fade into a gradient of stone. And then of course it will proceed with the regular black stone down for a certain level until eventually we reach the bottom of the world where there will be a gradient of bedrock, as with any overworld. The reason for this is that while we want a lot of really cool visuals and changes to a certain extent to how players progress and survive on the surface, we don't want to eliminate important Minecraft progression elements, particularly when it comes to mining and ores. We want those ores to still be able to generate and look nice in the stone, since they would not look nice in the endstone without a resource pack change to make it look like they're embedded in endstone, which is something else that we don't want to require of the other SMP goers, because it would affect the block palettes that they're able to use in their builds. One of the biggest changes going into the lunar phase from the Wastes is a much more clear picture, both for me and for Mchmu, as to what biomes, what specific custom biomes the lunar phase, the lunar world, will actually contain. Mchmu has spent a lot of time building and sending over some great reference images for the kinds of vibes and aesthetics and colors that she wants incorporated in the various biomes. And I have a few ideas that I was able to pitch as well to come together to create a cohesive idea of this experience. As always with custom dimensions though, I find it best to start with the terrain. My shaders are currently making this look like a truly proper lunar surface, but this is not the experience that I actually want for this world. I've mentioned in the comments before when people have asked, but I use complementary unbound shaders, and unfortunately because of the way that shaders work, there just really isn't a good solution and a way for them to handle the new environment attributes that Mojang has been making more available. So for example, a lot of the sky here obviously right now is very dark, we've got this gray fog, and of course the lighting and the contrast here, again, feels very realistic for a lunar surface, but doesn't feel very fantasy or alien or spacefaring or exciting, nice to look at. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my shaders off so we can get that lunar phase experience as I intended. The terrain has gotten a little darker, obviously that's going to be rectified some once we actually start decorating it, but the most important changes have come in with the sky. Obviously, to create the effect of being on the lunar surface, in space, on some kind of alien planet, what have you, I felt it was important to have the stars visible at all times, including during the day. We still have a daylight cycle, I have it frozen right now, so we're still going to have the sun and moon going over the world, and that will still affect the light level and what mobs can spawn. Passive mobs during the day and hostile mobs at night, but it will always look like the night sky or the space sky. We also obviously have green fog on the horizon because I felt that that contrasted nicely with the end stone here, still bright, so that especially it helps brighten up the horizon against the dark sky, but doesn't collide with, doesn't get too close to that end stone color and make this area really, really bright and just kind of harsh on the eyes. Obviously, we have the land masses distinct from the oceans that stands out on its own, and much of the terrain is going to, at least at first, appear relatively similar and certainly relatively tame. However, there are some key differences. First off, you'll see in the upper left corner there that the sea level is actually at Y92, which is much higher than the vanilla sea level of Y63. This change is for two reasons. First of all, the default block of the terrain of the dimension is endstone, but very similar to how the deep slit layer is handled, I'm using a surface rule to implement a gradient from the endstone into the stone, and then of course keeping that same surface rule of the stone into deep slate at about y equals 0. And I wanted there to be roughly the same amount of space that is occupied by stone as is occupied by deep slate. Again, so that we could have lots of access to ores, but also access to the stone itself and also the various stone types that generate in it. And so I needed that to be able to go up to about Y60 or so, and so I wanted some amount of the terrain above that to be endstone, though certainly not the same amount. With the transition from endstone to stone at about Y60, players are going to have to dig down, on average, 30 to 40 blocks probably in order to reach it, and so much of these caves here will probably be populated by other biome features as well, but I think it's important that we have these endstone caves up here to create that kind of shock and experience as players begin exploring the lunar phase before they actually get down and are able to start making vanilla progression. The second reason is not necessarily quite as strong as the first, in part because it was so natural after already making the terrain higher anyway, but I also wanted the oceans to be quite a bit deeper than they are in vanilla to give me more room for the features that Emchmoo and I have planned. We don't really have a great way, or certainly not an easy way, to create large craters with noise. We'll probably revisit finding a way to populate much of the terrain with smaller craters to at least sort of allude to that general lunar surface aesthetic. But in lieu of being able to create large circular craters, I've at least gone ahead and tried to make some areas where the terrain is able to, this is a very clear example. The terrain gets even lower into this depression. Again, not quite a crater, but a low area of the terrain that even just barely grazes the sea level. We get the very, very edge of what remains of the aquifers, which I've otherwise completely gutted, so that we can have a little bit of the terrain that is lower than the rest for perhaps more dangerous biomes that we'll come up with later. And then distinct from some hills that you'll find generally throughout the terrain, like these two right here, or even this one off here, we have these larger hilly sections. Not quite mountains, but they definitely can get quite large, more intended to be really big rolling hill areas. The features that we generate here will be quite distinct from those that we use to populate the biomes down in the lower sections of the world. And speaking of which, I think it's time to plan some. We want the main biome that populates these low flat areas, in particular the biomes that the players will spawn in, to be fairly barren. We want that kind of immediate barren lunar surface aesthetic, and especially end aesthetic, so we are going to have some chorus plants and things like that to populate this main biome here so that it feels like we're in a sort of end-like world, but still with some elements, some kind of vegetation that maybe makes it look hostile to you, hostile to the player, but would be potentially inviting to an alien, to make it look like this is a world that is alien to you, or you are the alien on, and it is not fit for you, but is its own kind of haunting beauty. So in addition to the chorus plants, we're obviously going to have some patches of grass so that we can have probably animals spawn on it, but I'll probably make them pretty uncommon, at least in this biome, and make them a different color, of course, probably purple to match the chorus plants, as well as the purple water that we already have per Emchmoo's request. This will of course change the color of the short and tall grass as well, but the dry grass is going to stay the same, which I think is ideal because it will look really nice against and especially on the end stone. I'll be able to make it so that both the dry grass as well as short grass, flowers, saplings, and things are able to be planted on end stone, both by worldgen and by players, and so that will give us a lot more flexibility with how we're able to decorate the ground. Speaking of that purple water, Mchmu was also really fascinated and excited by my end update video, and so has requested very specifically the same purple lakes that I implemented in that dimension and in that biome update. So we'll have, of course, the purple water that I already have, and have small lakes or clusters of lakes generate fairly commonly up here on the surface, so players won't have to go all the way out to the ocean, which I think is somewhere that way. They won't have to go all the way out to the ocean in order to get their first bucket of water. I do think under the lakes is going to be a good way to implement mud as well, so that that is accessible to players, and it should work really nicely to make the purple color pop, very similar to what I did color-wise for my Witch Realm project. Importantly though, I don't want the mud here on the surface, which if we make the mud the barrier of the lake feature is exactly what's going to happen. There's a couple of ways that I could mitigate and eliminate this, so I'll do some experimenting and decide what works best, I think. And then lastly, Mchmu's reference image for this biome included a really big, beautiful amethyst mushroom that had this white stalk made of stripped pale oak logs, and then this big mushroom head of amethyst blocks. And while I told her I can't recreate that with features one-to-one without just placing the build directly, which is certainly possible, it's something that she's considering, we can get pretty close to the general idea of it using something like a cherry log placer for the tree trunk type, and then we can use probably an acacia or dark oak foliage placer that uses amethyst blocks for the state provider, which should create a very nice and very alien mushroom-like shape that should fit very nicely with the chorus plants, in fact. Let's get all this implemented and see how it changes this barren landscape into a hostile alien world. Oh, right, I think this is definitely going to do it. This just looks so cool. A perfect marriage, I think, of all the ideas we've been talking about. You still get that barren sensation. Obviously, the dry grass and the endstone helps with that, but it does look kind of beautiful, and it does look lived in. Or like something could live here anyway. Let's talk about things in the order of how cool I think they are. Again, I really want to draw attention to the dry grass. I think it just adds so much here, so much color is an interesting word here because it's the same color, roughly as the endstone. It's the same, it matches very well with it, which is of course why I picked it. But it does add a kind of color and texture to the ground without needing to have this really high contrast, these really bright, vibrant purples here. We've got regions of it, but it feels isolated, which makes it work better when you have the rest of the area covered in this nice, very soft, kind of yellow tan-ish. The dry grass, as well as all of the short grass here, is all being handled by the same feature, which is just a simple block feature that I'm placing pretty much everywhere in the biome. And then the actual block state provider in the simple block feature is using a noise provider so that we have these large areas where it's just the dry grass, and then we have these kind of smaller, noisy patterned areas, some larger areas for sure, because that's how noise works, where it's the short grass instead, which of course has been changed to purple, just like the grass blocks. I decided to make all of the patches of grass blocks placed as part of the trees here, which I think turned out spectacularly. We've got some that just look like kind of solitary mushrooms like this. We do have some budding amethyst here, and I'm using the vine tree decorator to be able to have some vines hanging down, which also happen to inherit the foliage color, I believe. But like I was saying, the grass blocks here are being placed by an alter ground decorator in the tree feature, rather than being a feature of their own, like a vegetation patch feature or something. And I think that works really, really well to make these mushrooms feel like they are kind of either the source of or the main beneficiaries of the small patches of vibrant life that is able to cling to this lunar surface. I was able to get mud underneath the water of these lakes without affecting the surface, and like I said, there were a couple of ways I could have done that, but how I opted to do so was to make the barrier of the lake feature endstone rather than mud. So we had these lakes that have a ground made of endstone, and then separately, as a separate feature after the fact, I have a disc feature being placed fairly commonly in every chunk that's just replacing any endstone that has water or mud above it up to a certain distance with mud. So we get this kind of pocket of mud that descends down a little bit before eventually kind of turning back into that endstone. We get a little bit of a gradient. Just like with the various grasses, I was able to make it so sugarcane can be planted on endstone, allowing us to have access to sugarcane even in this initial biome. We won't have to go and dig underneath the ocean like we did in the wastes. And then I guess since I said we were going in order of coolness, last would be these chorus plants because they're just chorus plants. It's a feature that does exactly and only this, and that's okay because that's exactly what I needed. Now, while I was at it, I realized I simply could not go on without some aliens to populate my new dimension. So I went ahead and made some variants of all of the passive animals that I was able to. Here we have this lovely cyan-colored three-eyed cow with green horns and hooves. We have some fluffy purple pigs that have 4 eyes if you can look closely at the sides of their head in addition to the front. And one-eyed green chickens that will lay lunar eggs instead of regular eggs, which behave exactly the same as regular eggs, but of course will hatch lunar chickens, which are these adorable pink little puffballs that also have only 1 eye. The only mob that I couldn't change is the sheep, because they don't actually have variants, and I think that's hilarious because it means and implies that sheep are somehow from this planet, which I think is great. The only other thing I'll mention in this biome is I have populated the endstone caves below it. It's pretty sparse. I didn't want it to be like super duper extreme, but this is where players will be able to get a little bit more early access to grass blocks and dirt if they need it, instead of needing to only and exclusively dig up the small patches of grass that appear around the mushrooms here. So will be accessible down here, as is some amethyst embedded in the ceiling in some areas. These are both being handled, the ground and the floor, with vegetation patches that are just placing a noise pattern of these respective blocks. And then we've got some features that are placing the simple block feature for the dry grass and things down here. I also made end rods hang from the ceiling down here, mostly because I thought it was fun, but I actually realized that Mchmu plans on locking the end until about halfway through the SMP so that people can kind of experience and explore the lunar phase before we go and fight the dragon and stuff, and so I figured it'd be nice for people to still have access to end rods to build with. Now, the Lunar Wastes biome does end over here, and that's because I've kind of cordoned off this area so that we can start planning the other main biome that's going to populate the kind of flattish area of the dimension, which is going to be a very similar biome, but much more kind of forested and vibrant and alive. There is going to be much more grass here, not exclusively tied to the various trees that will generate here like we did with the mushrooms in the Wastes biome. And it is probably going to be colored a sort of cyan so that it can match well with these warped roots and nether sprouts that we're going to have populating a lot of the ground here, in addition to the short and dry grasses. These, of course, don't appear in the end, but do have a connection to the Enderman by way of the warp forests in the nether, and so we feel they still kind of fit and belong here. We're not going to carry over the chorus plants, but we are going to carry over the lakes. They'll just have a cyan watercolor instead of purple, again, to match the rest of the biome. But to really plan the rest of this, we need to go into a flat world and take a look at what Mchmu has been cooking up. So I mentioned before that Mchmu sent over some reference photos, which included a beautiful giant mushroom build that used pale oak for the stem and amethyst for the cap. And that was what I based my designs on for the actual worldgen. However, she's actually sent over the build for it, as well as the builds for the various trees that she used to use for the reference photos of our next biome here. And I requested these from her so that I could actually implement them as she has built them into the lunar phase. Now, unfortunately, we are going to be in 26.1.2 for this server, so while 26.2 added the new template feature, which would have been super great for placing all these, I will have to go ahead and use a fossil feature instead. This is going to result in some strange behavior, but especially for these trees here, that kind of alien-like appearance will hopefully work in their favor. My plan is to make these trees a little bit less common so that they look more, exciting and impressive, and they'll kind of be the focal point, the tent poles, as players explore this dimension. And then the rest of the biome will have smaller trees, similar to the smaller purple mushrooms that I made with the tree feature, that are based on this design and build upon it. They'll once again use acacia logs, and rather than jungle leaves, I'll probably use acacia leaves so that players are able to get acacia saplings in addition to jungle saplings. So these will be kind of like the elder trees that might have more kind of grown leaves compared to the smaller trees that'll be covering most of the rest of the area. Now, I did use the word forested earlier, but I definitely meant vegetated. It's not going to be a forest. We don't want that. We still want this to feel sort of barren, or at least sparse, like it's an alien moon of some kind, but it's going to have far more trees, far more leaves, and generally just more access to wood than the Lunar Wastes biome had. The last thing I'll add, Mshmoo also requested that much of the surface have small structures, ruins made of assorted metals, so that players would be able to access metals without needing to start to dig too deep too early necessarily, especially because we have that sort of end stone gradient, end stone progression before we get into the stone layers and deep slate layers that have ores. So I'll need to build a few of these to be able to place also as fossils on the surface of probably most biomes. This is an absolutely terrible example. I'm definitely going to spend a little bit more time coming up with like maybe a rover, perhaps like a small rocket ship or something. I'll come up with a few ideas, and then we'll get them all generated along with these fossil trees and purple mushrooms back in the Lunar Wastes biome. If you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe for more custom worldgen, structures, and data pack content. If you want to learn more about getting into worldgen yourself, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide that I've made for Data Pack Cup, where I am an official helper. And please check out all of the channels that I've linked in the description of creators that will be participating in the Lunar Phase. By the time this comes out, the Lunar Phase SMP has already begun, and players are live streaming and posting videos and sharing their experience as they explore this alien world. So I would really appreciate it if you go and see how everyone is enjoying the Lunar Phase. As with the Wastes, the Lunar Phase data pack will be made available to the public at the conclusion of the Lunar Phase SMP, but if you want to support the channel, you can still consider joining my Patreon to get early access to other projects, as well as see my videos ad-free before they come out. I think this is one of those biomes that doesn't necessarily look as nice from the sky. Let's hop back down to the surface and get a more accurate player experience as we walk through this biome. I think already this is looking a lot better. We get a much better view of all of the warped roots and nether sprouts that are able to generate here. Again, handled very similarly to the short and tall grass and short and dry grass in particular, with a simple block feature that's just using a noise provider to determine whether it should place the nether sprouts or the warped roots in small patches. I think the watercolor works really well with the mud in particular, but I'm a little disappointed that the cyan color for the grass doesn't translate quite as well for the sugarcane here as it did back for the sugarcane in the Lunar Wastes biome. I am satisfied with how these trees are getting placed. We definitely are going to have some areas, we'll probably see some as we start to fly around, where if it generates over uneven terrain, then it's going to sort of melt a little bit. This is something that is technically fixable with a feature stacking trick by placing a disk of light above the fossil for it to treat as flat ground before it projects down below it. But these builds are just a little bit too big for that to be very effective. So until we update to 26.2, this is kind of what we're stuck with for these guys. Now, continuing to walk around, we of course have these grass patches here, and you'll see that as we get to the borders of hills and things, the grass is being replaced with these warp blocks instead. This is exactly the same trick that I used in that end update video that I mentioned Mchmoo used as sort of an inspiration for at least some of the specific applications of features that she knew she wanted for this dimension. We don't want the exposed dirt texture, at least in this biome, so anywhere where the grass blocks get up to an edge that would expose that dirt, then we just place warp blocks instead. Now, like I mentioned, Mchmoo's trees are kind of meant to be these sort of tentpole figures that pop out on the horizon and have attention drawn to them, so they will always generate completely solitary, whereas the more traditional worldgen trees will generate in small groups and patches to create smaller forested areas. So again, this biome isn't meant to feel like a forest, but it is going to have these smaller kind of groves almost. Oh, we can see a purple mushroom, a couple purple mushrooms off in that direction as well. So we can check out how those builds are getting translated to the terrain. Definitely a little more warped as we get to hills here. I think there's definitely going to be opportunities for those to appear a little bit more broken than the larger trees do, just because of the nature of the block palette that they're working with. This one happens to be on pretty flat terrain and it is pretty intact, so that's good. But now let's go take a look at the metal salvage that we have generating here. Looks like we've got quite a lot of it, probably a little bit too much. This is a little rover that I built, made primarily of copper, and I'm using a processor as part of the fossil feature to replace some of the solid copper with raw copper, so it isn't necessarily just a complete treasure trove of metals. We've got one rocket made of copper that I've shaped a little bit using some acacia shelves here, and you can even, actually land on the ground, open this trapdoor on the bottom and climb up inside. Except it's a little bit too low. Let's do that. There we go. Climb up inside, close the trapdoor, and then you have a little window as you blast off into space. Now, these structures are small enough that I could have used the feature stacking disk trick in order to keep intact, but I specifically didn't want to do that for these metal salvage pieces because I do want them to kind of melt into the terrain. I do kind of want them to be, or at least have the potential to be broken so that it more properly looks like they are salvage. They are derelict machinery that you are harvesting for parts. As we come over here, it looks like we've got an iron antenna, which is obviously much more valuable than the copper over there. I'll check with Mchmoo as to exactly how common we want these salvage pieces to be. There are going to be like 50 creators here, maybe even more, so I could see wanting a lot of them to be accessible so that there's quite a bit available at the start of the SMP, but we'll have to play with it a little bit. Certainly, I have made it so that all of the copper salvage is more common than the iron salvage. And each of the three shapes come in both varieties. Now though, have you ever been just so done that you wanted to walk into the ocean? That's right, it's time to start planning the worldgen and features that are going to use to populate these massive oceans. And to do that, I think it's best that we once again return to the flat world and see what Mchmoo has sent me. Like me, Mchmoo is a fan of Subnautica, and so for the oceans, she would like to see some Subnautica-inspired features to populate the water. Which makes total sense. Subnautica is probably the best video game that we can draw inspiration from when it comes to creating an ocean for an alien planet. They have such a great grasp on the kind of alien biology that, whether or not it's realistic, creates for interesting gameplay and visuals. And so a lot of the inspiration that she's drawn from for these builds comes from the mushroom forest or fungal forest or whatever it's called in the first Subnautica game, which is also one of my favorites. In fact, she had already built these builds to demonstrate to use for the reference photos, and once again, I'm going to implement them as fossils that we can generate on the seafloor, but I've already actually created my own version of this biome in my New in Town Dimensions data pack for the Buried Ocean dimension, so I should be able to borrow some of the features from that pack, at least in the actual structure configuration, and then just change the blocks to match the palette that we have going on here. So where in that, I believe I made the trunks of my trees that I placed underwater out of prismarine. She is using these warped hyphae and stripped warped hyphae to create this beautiful pattern here. And I should even be able to use a noise provider for the trunks of my trees that will kind of replicate this style to also look kind of, warped and stripped away like this, or overgrown perhaps by the regular warped hyphae. And then for the foliage, I can again copy this same idea and use a noise provider to have a mix of resin blocks and shroom lights so that we have these nice orange paddles. Both on my trees probably going to be on top because that's just how most foliage providers work. But if I use a jungle trunk provider, we should be able to get some on the sides as well on branches. So again, because I already have features that do something very similar to this, I already have an idea of how we're going to execute and iterate on this idea as we expand it into the rest of the ocean. These blocks here on the sides are horn coral, and when the structures were sent to me, of course, they were all alive, but because there's no water here, obviously they have died. I'll be able to use the tick command to freeze the tick rate and then replace all of these coral fans before I save the structure blocks one final time so that they are alive when they get placed. And then they should inherit the waterlogged status when they get placed in water. Now, I think in addition to these fossil trees that again will kind of serve as the tent poles of the biome alongside the regular feature trees that I'll create to kind of replicate the style, I'll also have some small colonies of corals that I think I'll have with a ground of some mushroom blocks, brown mushroom blocks, and then maybe kind of like a central point that is this bubble coral block. And then we can have a few other corals around as well, maybe some seagrass and sea pickles and things. Obviously, they'll be underwater, so they won't die immediately. This is going to require some feature stacking, but should be pretty easy given the small quantity of features and the fact that they can all just get projected to the ocean floor height map. There we go, I think that gives a little bit of a better representation. Obviously, we will get some seagrass and kelp in here as well, both of which are important for general underwater decoration. It's a little unfortunate that they can't inherit the grass or foliage color in the biome, so they are just kind of stuck to green. So we might kind of try to organize them with some noise in patch-like situations so that they can kind of be in green areas without turning the entire ocean green. And same with sea pickles. We don't want to exclude these blocks just because they don't necessarily fit our vision. We want to find ways to incorporate them because they are important for players to be able to build with. Not to mention their other utilities such as for fuel or feeding and breeding turtles. This all should give us plenty to operate on, so let's go ahead and head back to the lunar world and see how all this can turn into a Subnautica-inspired ocean. I have some terrible news. I think I cooked a little bit too hard. Once I started working on the fungal forest here, I realized that having entire oceans, this whole huge space, all look exactly the same like this was not going to be satisfying for me, especially as a fellow fan of Subnautica. And so I kind of made 4 separate regions, basically quadrupled the amount of work that I needed to do for these oceans so that I could have just some absolutely beautiful kind of sub-biomes. And I do mean sub-biomes. There's only actually 2 ocean biomes. The ocean biome, the Proteus ocean as I'm calling it, and then the deep Proteus ocean to fill and populate the deeper oceans, the deeper terrain. There's just a lot to work through, so I'll try to move quickly and we will start with the fungal forest down here. You can tell pretty clearly the difference between Emchmu's trees, which are much pointier at the top and don't have any of the foliage, any of the discs up on top of them, and then my trees, which do. They're generally much straighter, they can be much taller, they'll often extend above the surface of the water, and they do have their foliage, these discs, these caps up on the top. But as I planned, we were able to use a noise provider for the trunks so that we can have this kind of growth, this noisy pattern of the warped hyphae, or warped stems, I believe in this case. Oh no, I did use warped hyphae. This noise pattern of the warped hyphae that seems like it's growing on the stripped warped hyphae as though that is the intended or natural state of these trees. And then we're able to use a noise provider for the resin blocks and the shroom lights as well. So resin is very accessible, shroom lights are very accessible, and we have an absolutely beautiful section of the ocean. I also made some smaller mushrooms that appear down here, and they tend to use primarily horn coral blocks as though they are juvenile. They're much smaller versions of these trees that have not yet grown to their full fungal status. One interesting thing I'll note is that while some of the coral, especially obviously on Mchmu's trees, is placed by the structure, is part of the structure, these horn coral fans, I have also horn coral fans on my trees as well, and indeed there's extra on Mchmu's. These are being placed by an additional disc feature that has a lot of fairly complicated, not terribly complicated, but a lot of rules in its rule-based state provider. Unfortunately, this was a necessary inconvenience on my part. I originally was expecting that I would be able to use a trunk decorator, place on trunk decorator in the tree to be able to place these on the northeast, south, and west faces of my trees. But unfortunately, that decorator appears to check hard-coded, check specifically if there is air in the block that it's attempting to place the decorative block in. And because this is water, even though it is non-solid, even though the coral would be able to survive there, it isn't able to be placed. So I had to get a little bit creative with it. Fortunately, I was able to expand that disc feature out to cover the entire ocean, so not only do we have horn coral populating all of my trees, but it also has some additional rules that's able to piggyback off of to place other types of corals and coral fans on different types of blocks. So over here in the fungal forest, the only blocks that's able to place the coral fans on that disc feature is the warped hyphae and stripped warped hyphae, as well as the fire coral blocks down here on these big old cones or domes, where it's able to place fire coral fans. Although this particular region is primarily based on the fungal forest from Subnautica 1, I borrowed the concept of these coral domes from Subnautica 2 specifically, in the coral dome region of the currently early access map. And so, as you might expect, we have this beautiful noisy pattern of resin blocks and fire coral to get that red and orange concept, aesthetic that we see in the game. And then inside, we have a noise pattern mixture of calcite and quartz blocks. Because as I learned from the Waste, players enjoy having quartz accessible without needing to go to the Nether. And the last thing that I'll mention in this region is the colonies, which once again I was able to do with feature stacking. Of course, because we're in 26.1.2, I had to use the old method of feature stacking, which involves placing a marker block way up at the top of the world, and then placing a bunch of vegetation patches above it to check for that marker block, and place a new vegetation feature down on a height map, in this case the ocean floor height map. And then we just kind of repeat that until I've placed all the features that I want, and get rid of the marker blocks so there's no evidence. In this case, we're placing a series of features starting with a few small discs of these brown mushroom blocks on the ground. Then we place this one bubble coral block in the middle to kind of serve as that middle part that the colony is kind of grown around. And indeed, the idea being that the mushroom blocks kind of grew from it as well. And then we place a whole bunch of simple block features that are these coral fans, as well as some sea pickles. And I believe seagrass has a chance as well. You can probably find another colony and see, yeah, there's a little bit of seagrass here. Now, to maintain what I was talking about in the planning stage by not turning the entire ocean green with seagrass and kelp, here in this particular region of the ocean, seagrass is pretty sparse and there is no kelp. If you want to find higher quantity of those, we'll need to go to some other regions, such as the kelp forest. This particular kelp forest region is inspired by the kelp forest from Subnautica Below Zero rather than the first Subnautica, which is why we're using horn coral for the kelpy foliage that makes up quite a bit of it, so that we get that bit of a yellower leafy kind of texture. These are just basic trees, very simple, straight trunk providers that are using a very small random spread foliage provider to get this kind of weird, wavy, leafy texture, almost like the leaves or kelp is flowing in the water, floating kind of freeform in the water, rather than kind of sticking to branches like a real tree would. So these are made with tree features, but designed to not really look like trees. To help differentiate the ground here from other regions, the trees are using an underground decorator to replace some of the sand with muddy mangrove roots. I think they add a really great contrast, especially with that kelp here, and is able to continue a trend that Mojang tries to follow when they're designing new biomes, which is having some good contrast and different block palettes between the ground and the canopy of a biome. Now, obviously, in addition to the larger yellow kelp, this is where you're going to find predominantly a lot of the regular kelp that you'll be able to use as fuel or to make dried kelp blocks and such. These are the only two regions that you're going to find in the regular Proteus Ocean. To find the other two regions, we have to go to the deep Proteus Ocean, and the first one here should be pretty immediately obvious, the Lily Pad Islands, once again inspired heavily by Subnautica Below Zero. The lily pad islands themselves, these giant lily pads that you see on the surface, are just fossil features, and thankfully I'm able to project them to a height map that includes water, that counts water as solid, and since the sea level is flat, I can just offset them down from that height map in order to keep them completely flat so that they have their lily pad head up here on the surface, floating on the surface of the ocean. But then as you descend down, that's when you can follow their stems, or I'm not actually sure what you would call this part of the lily pad, down to some islands that they are kind of holding up with their roots, which I think is so cool. And as you can see, because of the order that features get placed, some of these islands are going to get populated by the features that are searching down towards the seafloor, specifically things like the kelp, seagrass, sea pickles, and clay. Oh, and moss. Yeah, for the surface, the ground, the ocean floor of this region of the deep Proteus Ocean, we're using a noise pattern of sand, moss blocks, and clay so that we can have lots and lots of access to clay, but you do have to swim down for it, obviously, which again helps differentiate it from other regions while maintaining that same through line of a heavily sand surface. This is also where you're going to be able to find quite a bit of kelp in about the same quantities by X and Z axes as the kelp forest, but these columns of kelp are generally going to be shorter than those that you find in the kelp forest. It's also going to be quite a bit more of the seagrass, and then I'm also using a lot of glow lichen on the seafloor here, which is something that I don't use a whole lot of typically. I usually just leave it to the vanilla glow lichen feature, but I'm incorporating it here because if we turn off gamma mode here, I love the kind of speckled lighting that it adds to the seafloor, especially obviously in combination with the sea pickles from the colonies down there, but works really well even in areas that don't have those two, to make the, especially from the surface, make the lily pad islands region feel kind of alive and like a heartbeat almost. The final region of the deep Proteus Ocean down here is once again based on a biome from Subnautica Below Zero, the tree vents, and I'm actually really happy with how this was able to turn out. I would have preferred I be able to use Cinnabar instead of all this netherrack, so when I update this to 26.2, that is going to be one of the first things that I change. All of this is going to be Cinnabar, but since we're in 26.1, netherrack will have to do. It may be a little bit contentious to be using the tube coral so heavily as the surface coverage block, but especially with the gamma at normal levels, I think it works really well. We get these kind of stark, dark trees that are reaching up from the ground, and then the ground itself looks kind of bright. Obviously, the sea pickles are helping a little bit with that, but it has this sort of, comfort and calmness to it that comes from the blue color that isn't overwhelming at the light levels that you'll typically have this deep in the ocean. For the trees themselves, these are actual trees that have a small root provider to make them stand a little bit above the ground and have a little bit more shape to them. They're using the fancy trunk provider so that we get all these nice long forking branches. And then the magma blocks I'm actually really happy with because I was able to do that entirely within the tree feature. It's just foliage. Now what's interesting is if I just did that, we wouldn't get these bubble columns naturally because the tree feature does not schedule a tick after worldgen occurs, unlike other features like disks or simple blocks. And so in order to get these bubble columns, I'm simply placing a disk in this region, everywhere in this region, that replaces magma blocks with magma blocks, and that schedules a tick and makes it update the water blocks above it so that we get the block columns. This was not required for the soul sand that appears in these vents here, which are just some more fossil features that I'm projecting down to the ocean floor. I've made it so that they are able to melt. We're not using the disk feature here so that we get a little bit of variety and variation in their shape. And there are 3 different sizes. These smaller ones that only have a single soul sand in them. These slightly larger ones, actually this is the large one, that has 1 big vent with some soul sand, as well as 2 smaller ones. And then there's a medium-sized one as well that only has 2, I think this is one of those, only has 2 of the soul sand blocks to create these upward bubble columns. Yeah, I think it's without question the oceans are so far my favorite part of working on this dimension. The ability to pay homage to some of my favorite video games outside of Minecraft and be able to do so with such accuracy and such beauty is just incredible, and I cannot thank MCHMU enough for giving me an excuse and an opportunity to be able to do this. I'm using a lot of other really cool tricks here to be able to make the oceans behave how I want. You'll notice that as we get to higher terrain here, the kelp, the larger yellow kelp, stops appearing, and then we see mostly the regular kelp here. But if I talked about how and why I'm doing all this stuff, we would be in the ocean all day, and we have to move on. Back up on the lunar surface proper, we've got the lunar waste biome and indeed even a little bit of ocean off over there, but we want to now focus on filling in these big wide depressions that are a little bit lower than most of the rest of the terrain. This is where MCHMU and I want to place some of the more dangerous biomes. These areas tend to be a little bit less common and vary in size quite a bit. So we want some of the best resources to be found most plentifully here, but also some of the biggest risk. The first biome is one we're calling the Monochrome fields, which MCHMU shared some reference images of that showed a very gray landscape. Lots of pale moss, very, very sparse birch trees that have only a few pale oak leaves, just some barely clinging to life trees that are again very monochrome, very gray, and lots of snow as well. And although the reference images don't show it, MCHMU was very specific that she wanted a repeat of the hidden creaking hearts that I used in the wastes, where previously they were hiding underneath some tall cacti in small regions of the desert. They're going to be much more common here, buried underneath the ground and without any kind of surface indicator that they are there. That way, this biome, in addition to having regular hostile mobs, will have creaking guarding it as well. And I'll probably even change the timeline for this dimension so that creaking are active not at all times, but for much longer periods than just at night. And then the other biome is one that I proposed when I realized we didn't really have a specific place for Sculk to spawn at this time. There is technically an opportunity that the Deep Dark could have generated because I raised the terrain by so much. So even though we don't have mountains, which would normally be where deep dark biomes are able to generate, I didn't necessarily want so much of the underground to be deep dark because we kind of already did that for the wastes. So by having a specific Sculk biome, especially a surface one to kind of serve as a source of danger, as well as a source of all of the important elements that we would expect from a Sculk-infested biome, including ancient cities deep underground, I think that will shake things up enough while still providing some of the important resources here, like Sculk sensors, Sculk shriekers if for some reason you want them, and because of the ancient cities, echo shards and all the loot that comes with that. For this surface Sculk biome, I primarily want to focus on having a noise pattern of the Sculk blocks that have Sculk veins beside them so that it looks kind of like a stringy, cakey mess of Sculk starting to infect the surface rather than just Sculk completely covering it. And I don't want to do that with the Sculk patch feature that already exists either, because that's going to create real big globules. We'll probably use that underground, but not here on the surface. Now, unfortunately, Sculk is a block palette that I don't really work with that often, and so I am kind of struggling with coming up with other ways that I can make this biome pop and stand out. In particular, I'm struggling to think of a good vertical element for it. I'm probably just going to end up going with some big ol' spikes. Let me get rid of this thing. I'm probably just going to end up going with some big ol' spikes of bones, very similar to the granite spikes that we had in the wastes, which of course are based on designs and features from Incendium. I'm not necessarily specifically happy with this idea, but it does fit, or at least doesn't not fit. One thing that these biomes are going to have in common, though, is, like I mentioned, more valuable resources, and specifically a greater abundance of the metal salvage that we already have handled. That should be very simple. We just need to make an additional feature of the metal salvage. Geez, I cannot find any metal salvage here. That should be pretty simple. We just need to make a duplicate of the metal salvage placed feature that has a higher chance, a lower rarity than the placed feature that I'm using for them here in the wastes and the mutated wilds, which is what I've decided to name the cyan biome. And that'll hopefully make both of these biomes worth visiting despite the danger. The other thing that these two biomes will have in common is a greater abundance of craters than the lunar wastes and the mutated wilds, which of course means we need to add craters there as well. This should be very easy. I've done similar things before, and geodes are going to be the feature for it. Geodes are already very spherical features, or can be very spherical features, and so it's just a matter of making an air-based geode and then projecting it down so that it carves out a nice rough circle. It's a little bit of noise so that it doesn't look completely spherical, but generally a nice round shape in the ground. What I want to add to this, though, to make them just a little bit more interesting, is use some basic feature stacking, once again with that marker block trick in the sky, so that some of these craters have some meteorites in them. Maybe sometimes it'll be that raw iron, very similar to the salvage, and sometimes it'll be something a little bit more common like packed ice. Just a little something to suggest what actually impacted this area and made the crater. Craters themselves will be relatively common out in the other two surface biomes, but here in the Monochrome fields and the Sculk biome here, craters will be much more common, and as a result, the meteorites and metals that can potentially be found in craters should also generally be more common. So again, adding a little bit of value to visiting these biomes. That was a lot of planning, so it's time to actually start putting fingers to code. I will see you in a little bit. We'll start here in the Monochrome fields because this is where I happen to still be. This is so cool already. Before I start talking about the features, we'll address the elephant in the room. Yes, the fog is much more dense here. It is much closer to you. It is a darker gray color, and even the lighting gets a little bit muted, very similar to how you would feel and what you'd experience in the pale oak biome, which works really well because it helps make this biome feel much more claustrophobic compared to how it actually looks, especially from the outside. It's extremely barren. There isn't very much going on here as far as verticality, and so the closer fog helps to kind of mask that and make the biome feel much more compact. We do have the much more common salvage, like I mentioned, and we can even start to see, yes, here's a nice, very obvious crater here that's even exposed a pale oak log where there is a creaking heart, or was a creaking heart, indeed. It helped you out a little bit, saved you from a creaking. Here's a nice big crater that has a meteor of packed ice, and we can also see that the freeze top layer feature is freezing some of the exposed water from the aquifer. But of course, because of the way that geodes work, some of the water that has been exposed as a result of the crater is completely unmoving. Not much we can do about that. I'm handling the surface with vegetation patches, which importantly differs from the way that I was handling the ocean floor back in the ocean biomes. There I had to use discs because vegetation patch features, which would be my preference, don't work underwater. Here, I am able to use vegetation patches rather than surface rules because it gives me a lot more control over the noise pattern, which I am using here to place a mixture of grass and directly pale moss blocks. We'll see if I can actually find some. Here's some right here. And they're generally more performant than surface rules. Sorry, Mojang. We do have some sparse trees. They do help add a little bit of verticality in addition to some of the taller pieces of salvage. And as I mentioned, I made the foliage provider, the block state provider for the foliage, use a weighted state provider so that we have a mixture of pale oak leaves and air, which makes the leaves feel like they've started to decay away, even though they are obviously attached to some valid logs. Craters are much more common in this biome, as I mentioned before was the plan, but because of the way that the vegetation patches are working, you can't always necessarily tell what's a crater and what's just part of the terrain and the depression. So let's head back to the lunar waste real quick and we can see how regular craters work before we go take a look at some other biomes. And yeah, you can tell immediately that we still have that kind of lunar experience thanks to the pretty regular craters, I would say. We do still have that chance for the meteorites in the craters outside of the monochrome field, so you don't specifically have to go there to find those metals, but you're going to have a higher chance to because there are even more craters out there than there are over here. But most of these craters, as you'll see, are empty. However, I was able to get all of the dry grass, short grass, and other features to be able to generate inside of these craters to help suggest that they aren't necessarily recent additions. Some of them might be, just based on the order that features happen to generate, but in general, the features that place all of these blocks and trees and things are able to use a height map that checks if the terrain has been lowered by a previous feature, such as a geode. I've made the difference between the monochrome fields biome and the Sculk flats biome based primarily on the weirdness noise map. So anywhere where weirdness is particularly high or low, we're going to get Sculk flats instead of monochrome fields, but both will still generally be in these more depressed areas, which you can tell a little bit right here. Once again, when you're in the Sculk flats, the fog is going to get quite a bit closer, even darker, and that lighting, that ambient lighting, is also going to get a little bit darker. It doesn't specifically or necessarily impact mob spawning, it just creates that kind of eerie, gloomy sensation, though it's a little less necessary here because the Sculk biome has so much more going for it as far as population to give you that claustrophobic or uneasy feeling. Obviously, all these Sculk sensors and potential for Sculk shriekers that can in fact spawn wardens helps a lot with that, but I am pretty satisfied with what I was able to do for the bone spires as well. Rather than making the block columns that make up these spikes just use solid bone blocks, I had them use a noise-based state provider to place a mixture of bone blocks and Sculk blocks to, very similar to how we handled the fungal trees back in the oceans, make it look like the Sculk is growing onto and infecting the bones in a controlled and natural manner. Speaking of the Sculk, the solid Sculk blocks that you see on the ground are being placed by a vegetation patch that's once again using a noise provider to place a mixture of Sculk blocks and endstone blocks, but the Sculk veins that you see here are being handled a little bit differently. These are using what's called a multi-phase growth feature, which is a feature that is designed pretty specifically for Sculk veins and for glow lichen, but I'm using some very specific placement modifiers to determine where those multi-phase growths can get placed, and then also controlling what blocks multi-phase growths are allowed to be placed on. Specifically, only endstone and bone blocks, not Sculk blocks. And the result is very nice. Not only do we get lots of these Sculk veins that are covering the ground as you'd expect, but they also inch up the walls of blocks as you would expect as well, in a way that I wouldn't be able to do with just like a simple block. Now, like I mentioned, although I didn't want these particular shapes for the surface of the Sculk Flats biome, underneath it, I am just using those vanilla features to cover quite a bit of the terrain here with the Sculk blocks and Sculk veins and all the associated blocks. And then as you descend down deep enough, that's where you might be able to find an ancient city. Let's see if we actually got lucky here. I would bet probably not, but this isn't a small Sculk Flats biome, so we could run into one. Oh yeah, looks like we did. Awesome. And in the endstone caves underneath the monochrome fields, we're able to get, once again, more pale moss on the ceiling, plenty of this gray pale grass on the floor, which is of course just grass that has been recolored for the biome, as well as natural eye blossoms, which don't appear on the surface, but are pretty common down here underground. This is also a good opportunity, I think, to mention that I've been implementing Bonemeal Behavior in all these biomes so far, so that players will be able to grow lots of interesting things depending on the biome that they're in. Let me find a nice area of grass that I can clear, get rid of some of this snow here. And then if we use some bone meal, let's see how quickly, yes, so we are able to get eye blossoms here in the monochrome fields, as well as a blue orchid in this case. I'm using a noise-based state provider for a flower feature that is able to be placed here so that flowers are able to be obtained, or specifically all flowers, all colors of flowers, are able to be obtained in every biome. But if you use bone meal on the same blocks, the flower that grows on that block is always going to be the same, just the same as it would in the flower forest biome in vanilla. If we continue to clear this away, we'll see if we're able to get the rarer spawn from the bone meal here. Oh, here we go. So there is a tree that is grown just from bone mealing the grass, the same kind of tree. And indeed, this one is not using the weighted state provider, so we get a full head of foliage. And in fact, the way I'm doing this for this particular project is really interesting, because normally what you would do is simply list all of those features, all those configured features in the configured feature tag file, and they would all have an even chance to be able to generate when you bone meal from grass, except of course for the short and tall grass. Those are hard-coded to always be available. What I'm doing differently for this particular project though is making the feature that is listed in that configured feature tag a random selector feature type that then has a bunch of different weights and percentages for the different specific configured features that I actually want it to place. So I'm able to make it so that here in the monochrome fields, you're more likely to get eye blossoms than the regular flowers, and you're more likely to get both of those, or either of those, than a tree, for example. Whereas if I were to just list each of these features independently from one another, then they would all have an even chance of generating when you bone meal. I do still have to list each of those features as unplaceable within the biome files feature list, but that is a small price to pay for a huge amount of control and configurability over not only what features players are able to get when they bone meal, but also how much. Other features that are able to be placed from bone meal include the large amethyst mushroom trees, though not the ones that Mchmu built. And in the mutated wilds, the large acacia trees that have the cherry foliage placers, though again, not Mchmu's build. Now, although I said we weren't going to really change the underground regions of the world very much, it became unavoidable to start to come up with some cave biomes. Much of the surface is already getting filled. We really only have one region left to add a new biome for, and so that still leaves a few blocks that need to be accessible, as well as some cool ideas that we want to see visited. Specifically, one of the other SMP goers, Etat, suggested a slime cave biome, which I am definitely all on board with. I love the idea of a slime cave with lots of slime blocks, of course, but also moss and probably verdant frog lights as well. We can have green water rather than purple like it is currently with lily pads on it, and I think this would also be a great place to add some pitcher plants as well. This should make exploring underground feel a little bit more alien and worthwhile than just the vanilla underground mining experience. There will be some pockets of new activity for players to explore and experience as they are still on the Lunar Phase SMP. Now, when it comes to missing blocks, we do have regular sand, but we don't have any red sand nor sandstone. And so I think a cave biome is going to be a great way to incorporate that. Some kind of like an Martian cave that seems like it's filled with a kind of iron, but more the red iron that we would expect from Mars, from space. This is also going to be probably where cacti are going to live. They don't necessarily fit that iron idea, but they need to go somewhere. I'll probably steal the bulk of the features for the Martian caves from my own Overrealm project, specifically the Badlands caves from my Desert Update video, but I'll probably add a little bit of changes here and there to add a little bit more of that redness, that Martian feel, in addition to, of course, the cacti that aren't Martian at all. But before these new cave biomes can join the dripstone caves and lush caves here in the lunar world, we need to head back to that flat world to build one more fossil feature that we need to populate the underground with. So I didn't need to do this, but since I was duplicating some behavior over from my Overwhelm project anyway, I figured I would also implement some custom dungeons like I'm doing for that video series. The aesthetic design of these dungeons is loosely based on the precursor basis from Subnautica 1, though I say loosely not necessarily in terms of intent, but in terms of execution. I can't say that I'm incredibly satisfied with the color palette that I was able to hit with these, but I didn't want to use like really valuable blocks like coal or something, or even blackstone from the Nether that might fit better, but I think just wouldn't actually fit the surrounding environment. We are, however, using manufactured blocks like lime and green concrete, as well as lime and green terracotta here. We have 3 variants of the structure for these dungeons. All of them are the same in terms of function, but just have different layouts and configurations of platforms, staircases, bridges, and in some cases ladders that you need to climb up to traverse the entire dungeon. And you want to traverse the entire dungeon in order to reach all or most of these lime platforms, which are always accessible in each of these other 3 variants. This is just the template that I used to build all the rest. I haven't really been taking advantage of it so far for all of these other fossil structures, but the fossil feature requires 2 structures to be placed. For the rest of these, I'm just placing an empty structure, just a 1x1 structure void, because I don't actually need it for their behavior, and while I don't technically need it for this, I do find it advantageous. First, the dungeon fossil structure is going to place the actual structure of the dungeon, and then overlaid on top of that, it's going to place this arrangement of one of these random arrangements of chests or black wool, and then a processor that'll get applied to the overlay structure in particular is going to replace some percentage of these copper chests with air and some percentage of these black wool blocks with air. And then all the remaining black wool blocks are going to get turned into an assortment of mob spawners to really replicate and take over the job of the traditional dungeon or monster room feature. I haven't actually decided what mobs I'm going to have these spawners able to spawn. In theory, I would like Endermen because, of course, they're very end related, they're very alien, but they also aren't hostile, and I don't want to implement any function behavior to force them to be hostile because I think there's going to be plenty enough on the server going on. So we'll figure that out once we implement these along with those cave biomes, though these are going to generate in all the biomes of the lunar world, and they will replace the monster room feature. Oh, awesome. We got a Martian cave right away. This is great. I mean, it's exactly what I expected. It's pretty much, again, just the Badlands caves from my Overwhelm project, but I'm satisfied with it nonetheless. I opted to use regular terracotta for the walls so that terracotta could also be accessible, since that was another block that I realized was missing, which is why I'm really glad that I borrowed the features from an existing project, because otherwise I would have forgotten. As expected, the red sand works very well for the ground, and we're using a noise pattern of red sandstone and yet more terracotta, as well as some granite to kind of break up the ceiling as well. And then the last thing I added were these crimson roots on the ground, which again just serve to add that little bit of a pop of red to imply that iron-heavy nature, and contrast very well with the green cacti that otherwise stand out. Let's move on through here though, because I'm pretty sure, yes, I saw a slime cave. We'll see if it's a big enough one to get the gist. Yeah, I would say probably. I can go ahead and turn my gamma off and we can see the effect that the verdant frog lights have on the environment. This biome definitely had a lot more creative intent put into it than the Martian caves, because I was able to borrow so much of the Martian caves from some existing creative intent. The ground is being handled by a bunch of waterlogged vegetation patch features, which is placing all these pools of water and automatically placing the ground state, which is just moss blocks, anywhere that borders air, so that we get these fully enclosed pools of water. The waterlogged vegetation patch then places as a vegetation feature several simple block features with various chances, some of which get projected up with a random offset of 1 so that we get lily pads on the surface of the water, and some of them get random offset 1 up, and then a little bit off to the left and right of the X and Z axes to place an assortment of bushes, ferns, tall ferns, and those all-important pitcher plants like I mentioned. Underneath the water, you probably can't tell through the green water, but we have lime terracotta. So this is a natural block not only found in those dungeons, which we still need to take a look at and make sure they're generating right. The ceiling then is made of green terracotta as well as a small noise pattern of slime blocks, but the bulk of the slime comes in through the walls, which I'm handling in the same way that the terracotta in the Martian caves is handled, via disc that is being peppered throughout much of the slime cave biome, but is not replacing important blocks like ores and things. The ceiling vegetation patch is placing some block columns that are going downward as a vegetation feature that have between 1 and I think 3 or 4 slime blocks, and then a chance for a verdant frog light to be the last block that it places. There are more verdant frog lights being placed by a simple block feature, and those specifically are only getting placed in slime blocks that have an air block adjacent to them, like this one. So that looks like they're kind of growing in the walls, which is really, really cool. I've also added a variant of frog here, which is meant to look like an alien frog that evolved to be similar to the pitcher plant. Its eyes are a little bit different, and it has a third eye on its back so that it can keep an eye out for predators. It is technically able to spawn here, and there should be plenty of light for it, but I've yet to find a naturally spawning one. And so just to be safe, I've made it so that frogs can also spawn in the deep Proteus ocean. Since I needed to make them able to spawn on moss blocks anyway for the slime caves, it just made sense that they'd be able to spawn here as well on the lily pad islands that are also made of moss blocks. And now we can check out one of the custom dungeons, this one exposed to a Martian cave in this case, which is great. Nevertheless, we can come up in here and take a look at some of the mobs that I've made able to spawn here. First up, we have an endermite. These endermites are able to spawn here and behave just like normal endermites. They're hostile, they don't have any drops. And you may notice as well, we have a lime green shulker down here that I was able to make spawn from the spawner. Looks like the spawner has gotten quite a bit active, but I did make it so that all of the shulker spawners are only able to successfully spawn a shulker if there isn't already a shulker present. Of course, since they do teleport away, you can get them out of range. So this one is, able to continue spawning shulkers because they all keep teleporting too far away outside of its range. But that does mean that shulkers are farmable here in the overworld, which I did check with Mchmu about, and she did confirm that this is probably for the best because the end is going to be inaccessible for a good chunk of the SMP's lifespan, for some of those 30 days. And so we want players to be able to gather shulker shells and get shulker boxes so they can build things, because that is of course a big part of SMPs like this. The loot that you can find in these chests is normal dungeon loot, but also includes a random chance for random saplings. In fact, a guaranteed chance for some amount of random saplings. That way, saplings can be renewable, and that does include things like bamboo and stuff too. While the saplings that appear as loot in dungeons specifically aren't necessarily renewable, it makes saplings accessible and therefore renewable, and saplings are also available from trial spawners in trial chambers, which also generate here and also makes them renewable. Now we do have one more region that we need to fill with a custom biome, this big rolling hilly region here, but before we do that, Mchmu has sent over one last set of builds that we need to implement. Even though the lunar world will include some vanilla structures like ocean monuments, trial chambers, and the ancient cities like I mentioned, some structures will not be available, and one of those would have been villages if Mchmu had not built a beautiful kind of moon-based designed space village here for us to use. She provided all of the building structures for me to then add the jigsaws to, and then I made some simple roads to work with them. As you can see, they're designed to look somewhat like, maybe not quite Subnautica, but certainly kind of, sci-fi inspired habitat builds. So we've got some small houses like this that we can walk inside of. A couple of jigsaw blocks are going to be inside many of these houses to be able to spawn the villagers. And then there's some jigsaw blocks on the roads to be able to spawn some iron golems as well. Inside of these chests is going to be pretty standard village loot, but it's also going to include that additional sapling loot table that the dungeons and trial chambers and such will have. They've got several varieties of houses, including a really cool kind of two duplex type design right here that's got a little tube in the middle between them, as well as a triple house right here that's got this sort of front foyer and then two side rooms over here. These also serve as an additional source of end rods, not to mention more quartz and all this glazed terracotta if somebody wants to be a monster and rob these villagers of their homes. As far as workstations, we have a small farm that obviously has a bit of like a greenhouse, glass dome over it, a small library that does have library loot inside, a temple that's clearly very similar in design to the Plains Temple, but obviously has a glass dome on top instead of just an open roof. And finally, the blacksmith building, which you can access the furnaces for from the inside, and the chest right here is going to randomly roll between whether it is an armorer, toolsmith, or weaponsmith loot table, but will still include that sapling loot table as well. I didn't make a specific town center, and neither did Mjmu, so I'm just using the crossroads here as the town center, but this can also appear as a regular road throughout the village as well. This small lamppost has a chance to generate from any of these jigsaw blocks along the side of the road that are also able to generate the buildings in case there isn't enough room for a building, so that it has a chance to spawn something to help populate the ground, and a lamppost will also generate right here in the middle of the crossroads as well. All of these jigsaw blocks here have a chance to spawn villagers, or this one is guaranteed to spawn an iron golem. And then we have a straight road as well as a road that curves to the left, as you can tell by that jigsaw block right here, and a road that curves to the right by that jigsaw block right there. Setting up the template pools for all of these roads should be simple, so I'll do a little bit of testing to make sure that the frequency of buildings and the crisscrossing of roads all looks good, and then show you that result. I've flown around a bit and seen a few villages, and this one so far has proven to be the largest that I can find. It has spread out quite a bit. I would imagine that that crossroads there is probably the town center, but it could theoretically be any of these crossroads. Ended up getting quite a grid-like system going on here, which is probably uncommon. Now, because of chunk loading orders, certainly sometimes these geodes, these craters, can completely destroy parts of these villages. There's not really too much I can do about that, unfortunately, but I think that they kind of add a little bit of story here. So these villages are not necessarily safe from the environmental hazards that are at play when you're building on the moon. For the roads, it should be pretty clear that I'm using a processor to replace a small amount of the polished diorite with calcite or smooth stone. The roads are going over lakes in some places, and again, depending on that chunk load order, we've got a processor being applied to the roads to replace any roads that get placed in water with pale oak planks, again, to kind of fit in, but also work similarly to how they behave in the vanilla villages. We can also see another situation where, again, because of the chunk generation order, this crater ended up generating before the village ended up in this chunk, but villages use, or structures in general rather, use the world surface worldgen height map, not necessarily the world surface height map, and so the road is built over the crater as though the crater wasn't there because it's using the original surface level. Again, not really anything I can do about that. That's just gonna happen sometimes because of the order in which chunks generate and because of the size of these craters. Villages like this are probably going to be pretty uncommon. This is a pretty big one, but villages in general are coded currently to have about the same frequency as vanilla villages, but of course vanilla villages are able to appear in only 5 biomes out of like 70 in the overworld. And here, there's only 2 biomes that they're able to generate in, the Lunar Wastes and the Mutated Wilds, but these make up a pretty large portion of the world, and so probably villages are going to be a little bit more common on average than in the vanilla overworld, despite having technically the same values. Now though, let's take a look at planning the final biome that'll fill this hilly region, the Torchflower Meadows. Mjmu provided some pretty clear references for what she wants from this biome. However, I think I'm going to take a few creative liberties from some other sources that she provided too. She definitely wants the entire surface to be grass. In her reference image, the grass is green, but my suspicion is that that's mostly due to her not being able to change the color in her little build world that she is using to come up with these references, because some of the reference photos that she provided along with it from like other media and things show the grass is red. And so I think that's what I'm going to go with, because I like that a lot more, especially in combination with the torch flowers. We can get an idea here of what those torch flowers are going to look like roughly. Obviously the grass is purple right now, so not a perfect one-to-one for how it's going to look, but we can already tell that the torch flowers I think are going to add some great color, especially when they don't have the end stone as a backdrop. In fact, I think in this biome in particular, I am going to be okay with that dirt showing on the sides here. I think it'll make this biome feel much more, vegetated and alive and meadow-like, which is great. Some of the references also show a lot of short grass, which I think will add, a very important texture to this biome. But I think I'm going to pretty much cover the entire thing in a mixture of, get out of my way, sir, in a thick mixture of short grass and torch flowers, probably again using a noise provider so that we have large-ish clusters of torch flowers, and then the entire rest of the biome will have the short grass in very thick quantities. But those will be broken up by some small bushes, probably with purple leaves, I think even more purple than we have currently here as sort of the default for the lunar world right now. And then to expand on the colors coming from the torch flowers here, I think I can once again make use of resin to help decorate this area. And what I think I'd really like to do and be interested in is try experimenting with like a really weird tree shape, and specifically a tree that is made of multiple tree features. I think I should be able to, if I use block tags correctly, make it so that resin is counted as a block that trees are allowed to grow in and grow through, so that I can place the same tree feature in the exact same position multiple times with just a high count, and that'll allow it to kind of branch out in several different directions depending on the trunk provider that I use for it, to potentially make kind of like a weird, large, almost candelabra-like flower or tree type shape. I'm not super sold on these ideas, but I do want to try them to really round out the visuals that are available in this lunar world. So let's see how that ends up shaking out. I would say this is pretty satisfying, I think. It's obviously a very stark difference from the lunar wastes in particular, but even the mutated wilds, to this, very red, very dark biome, but it has a lot of highlights going for it, and it still has that important alien aesthetic to it. As we fly over this and start to see the sky color change to kind of like a hazy red, which I hope isn't too harsh. I kind of like it, especially for this very alien biome that I would imagine would have a bit of a thicker atmosphere. But as we fly over, we can see how the noise pattern of those torch flowers ends up creating just this beautiful brightness to this biome, where all the rest of the ground is covered in this very thick, dark brush. The purple bushes, I think, help provide some really great contrast. Again, they're still kind of dark, but they are very distinct from the red and help kind of break up and almost complete the aesthetic that is created by all of this vegetation here. I also added some cactus flowers down here, since I don't believe those would be able to spawn from the cacti down underground, but these are being placed by a place on ground decorator by the bushes, so that we have these kind of small flower patches, even suggesting that these might eventually grow into the purple bushes that we have here. And then, as you can tell pretty much right away, the resin tree idea did end up working pretty well, I would say. They're a little bit boxy. I think there's not too much that I'd be able to do about that. This is just kind of the randomness that we get from how these particular tree placers, the trunk placers, are bending. But while some of them end up very, boxy and squarish, like this one right here, others do end up looking, quite floral, quite alien, even like this one right here that's got these like hoops here. I really like the varying amounts of shapes that we get from these that we wouldn't necessarily get from having them placed by fossils, having them be structures that I had to build. This is also the only place that pumpkins are able to grow, and I've even made it so that some of the time they can be carved pumpkins. Not for any real reason, I just thought it'd be fun. Oh, and this is also our first look at the alien wolf that I created as well. These have 3 eyes, 1 is on the front and then 2 on the side, very similar to the pigs. They are yellow and they will get angry correctly. Oh, yep, look at those red eyes. And we've got an adorable baby form as well. I love that tail. The Torchflower meadows don't have any higher concentration of metal salvage, and in fact they don't have any craters, so they aren't necessarily as profitable to explore as the Monochrome fields or the Sculk flats, but serve as a great safe haven, I would say, thanks to the huge amounts of grass and vegetation and important resources, even like pumpkins, for getting iron golems or making pumpkin pies or what have you. I've sent everything off to Mchmoo, and so far she is pretty satisfied. We'll see if there are any changes that need to be made ahead of the SMP, especially with consideration to the world border, which is going to be about 6,000 by 6,000 blocks due to the huge amount of new players compared to the wastes. And so with everything complete, I'll hand it off to Future Cano to blast off to the Lunar Phase. Remember to like and subscribe for more custom worldgen structures and data pack content. You can check the link in the description for a very thorough written guide on getting started with custom worldgen. Remember to check out all the other creators playing in the Lunar Phase and check out my Patreon to participate in NPC fights at the end of every video like this one. Congratulations to today's winner, CamRob56, and thanks for watching!